Beneath 12 feet of glacial till in the Cascade foothills, a backhoe operator named Marcus Chen unearthed something that would rewrite evolutionary history and force humanity to confront a question we thought we'd answered millennia ago. Are we truly alone? The bones were massive, humanoid, and impossibly old. But what terrified the scientists wasn't their age or size. It was the evidence carved into the surrounding stone and what it revealed about who had buried them. Some secrets, they would learn, were kept hidden for a reason. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when the excavator's bucket struck something that shouldn't have been there. Marcus Chen killed the engine immediately. 22 years operating heavy machinery had taught him the difference between rock, root, and other. This was other. He climbed down from the cab, boots sinking into the October mud of what would become the foundation for another luxury housing development in the shadow of Mount Rainier. The site supervisor, Danny Reeves, was already trudging toward him through the downpour, reflective vest gleaming. "What's the hold-up?" Marcus pointed into the trench. "Found something." They both stared into the excavation. Protruding from the grey clay wall, approximately 12 feet below grade, was what appeared to be a section of bone, massive, ancient, and undeniably structural. Not a rock, not a tree. Bone. "Jesus," Danny breathed. That's big." "Yeah?" Marcus pulled out his phone, snapping photos despite the rain. "We need to call someone." The someone turned out to be Dr. Sarah Vance, a paleoanthropologist from the University of Washington who happened to be working on a Pleistocene megafauna site 40 miles south. She arrived within 2 hours, climbing into the muddy pit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent half her career in holes in the ground. Sarah's first examination was cursory, enough to determine they weren't looking at a bear, an elk, or any other regional fauna. Her second examination, conducted under a tarp with proper lighting and hand tools, took 3 hours. By the time she emerged, her expression had shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching disbelief. "We need to secure this site," she said quietly. "Now. No one else comes down here. No photos leave this location. I need to make some calls." Danny frowned. "What is it?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, rain streaming down her face. "I don't know yet. But if I'm right about what I'm seeing, we're going to need specialists, lots of them, and we're going to need absolute discretion." By dawn the next morning, the construction site had been quietly transformed into a scientific excavation. Orange construction fencing had been replaced with opaque barriers. The crew had been sent home with full pay and strict NDAs. 3 additional researchers had arrived in unmarked vehicles. Dr. James Okonkwo, a forensic osteologist, Dr. Lin Zhang, a specialist in ancient DNA, and Dr. Robert Whitmore, whose official title was comparative primatologist, but whose actual expertise ran toward the theoretical boundaries of hominid evolution. They worked in a tent erected over the excavation, powered by portable generators, insulated against the November cold that had followed the rain. Sarah had spent the night carefully exposing more of the skeleton, working with brushes and dental picks, documenting every millimeter. What emerged from the clay was impossible. The femur alone measured 22 inches, longer than any human's, built to support immense weight. The pelvis, when they uncovered it, showed a bipedal structure with a bowl shape that could only belong to an upright walker. The vertebrae suggested a spine adapted for both vertical locomotion and incredible strength. And the skull, when Sarah finally exposed it on the 3rd day of excavation, stopped all conversation in the tent. It was humanoid. Unquestionably, the brow ridge was pronounced, the face prognathic, the sagittal crest prominent, but the cranial capacity, measured carefully by Dr. Okonkwo, fell within the range of Homo sapiens. The mandible showed evidence of both grinding molars and pronounced canines. The zygomatic arches were massive, suggesting powerful jaw muscles. "This isn't Gigantopithecus," Robert said, crouched beside the skull. Gigantopithecus was a quadruped, and it never made it to North America. This is Christ. This is bipedal megafauna with a human-sized brain. Leanne was already taking samples, carefully drilling into the densest part of the femur to extract material for radiocarbon dating and ancient DNA analysis. "Bone quality is remarkable," she murmured. "Mineralization patterns suggest significant age, but the preservation is exceptional. This clay must have created an anaerobic seal." "How old?" Sarah asked. "Preliminary guess? Late Pleistocene, somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years. We'll know more when the C14 results come back." James was photographing the skeleton from every angle, his face drawn with concentration. "Pathology here," he said, pointing to the left femur. "Healed fracture, significant bone remodeling. This individual survived a major leg injury and lived for years afterward." "Which means social structure," Robert said. "You don't survive a broken femur in the Pleistocene without help, without care." Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the skeleton. In her 15 years of fieldwork, she'd excavated Homo erectus in Georgia, Australopithecus in Ethiopia, Neanderthal remains in Spain. She knew the morphology of the human family tree. This didn't fit anywhere on it. "There's more," she said quietly. The others looked at her. She pointed to the edges of the burial site. "This wasn't a natural deposition. Look at the arrangement. The body is articulated, positioned deliberately, and the clay around it, there are tool marks. Someone dug this grave." Indeed, the implications hung in the air like smoke. "You're saying this was buried," James said. "Intentionally. I'm saying someone cared enough about this individual to dig a grave 12 feet deep in glacial clay and position the body with obvious intention. And I'm saying that whoever did it understood death, understood ritual, and had the cognitive capacity for abstract thought." Robert's expression had gone very still. "You're suggesting there was a population?" "I'm suggesting this wasn't the only one," Sarah said. Over the next week, they expanded the excavation carefully, searching for additional remains or artifacts. What they found was both more and less than they'd hoped for. 20 feet from the primary burial, they discovered a second skeleton, smaller, possibly female, showing similar morphology. Then a third, a juvenile, positioned between the two adults. The arrangement was unmistakable, a family group, buried together. But it was the objects found with them that changed everything. Scattered around the burials were worked stone tools, not the crude hand axes of early hominids, but sophisticated scrapers, awls, and blades that showed evidence of hafting. The lithic technology was consistent with late Pleistocene cultures in the Pacific Northwest, but the size of the tools suggested hands far larger than human, and there were pigments. Red ochre and black manganese applied to the bones themselves in patterns that might have been decorative or might have held symbolic meaning. The use of ochre in burials was a hallmark of cognitive sophistication, of symbolic thought, of culture. "This is Homo," Robert said flatly on the 8th day. They were sitting in the research tent, surrounded by photographs and preliminary data. "I don't know what species, I don't know how it fits into the existing taxonomy, but this is unquestionably genus Homo. Tool use, symbolic behavior, complex burial practices, evidence of caregiving. These are the markers of humanity." Leanne had received the preliminary DNA results that morning. She spread the printouts across the table, her hands shaking slightly. "The DNA is degraded but recoverable, and you're right. The mitochondrial genome shows clear affinities with the Homo lineage. There's even evidence of interbreeding. We're finding genetic markers consistent with both Neanderthal and Denisovan introgression." "Which means what?" Danny asked. He'd been allowed into the research tent after proving he could keep his mouth shut and follow basic archaeological protocols. "They were human. They were hominid," Sarah corrected. "They were our relatives, not Homo sapiens, but close enough that our ancestors could, and apparently did, interbreed with them, like Neanderthals." Like Denisovans, another branch of the human family that we shared this continent with. And then what? Danny pressed. Where did they go? The question everyone had been avoiding. Sarah looked at the bones, carefully laid out on examination tables, cleaned and measured and photographed. A family, buried with care, marked with ochre, provided with tools for whatever journey their culture believed came after death. Climate change at the end of the Pleistocene, she said. Megafauna extinctions, human population expansion, the same pressures that eliminated mammoths, short-faced bears, giant ground sloths. A large-bodied hominid would have required enormous caloric intake. When their food sources declined, extinction, Robert finished. But something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. On the 10th day, as they were carefully backfilling the site, the remains had been removed to a secure university facility. One of the graduate students called out from the edge of the excavation. "Dr. Vance, you need to see this." Sarah climbed down into the pit. The student was pointing at the clay wall, where erosion from the recent rains had exposed a deeper stratum. Embedded in the ancient sediment was something that made Sarah's breath catch. A handprint, not fossilized, not mineralized. Pressed into clay that had hardened over millennia, but preserved with perfect clarity. The hand was enormous, nearly 12 inches from palm to fingertips. 4 fingers and an opposable thumb. The dermal ridges were visible, the print as clear as if it had been pressed yesterday, and below it, carefully carved into the hardened clay with some kind of tool, were symbols, not pictographs, not representational art. Abstract geometric patterns, circles, lines, chevrons, arranged in deliberate sequences, the kind of marks that suggested counting or record-keeping or something even more complex, the kind of marks that suggested writing. Sarah stared at the wall, her mind racing. The burial was 13,000 years old according to the radiocarbon dating, but this handprint, this carving, was in a sediment layer above the burial, younger, perhaps much younger. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. James appeared at her shoulder, saw what she was looking at and went white. "Sarah, if those marks are linguistic, if there's intentional symbolic encoding, then someone was here after the burial," Sarah finished. "Someone came back. Someone remembered. Or," James said very quietly, "someone is still here." That night, Sarah called an emergency meeting in the research tent. The core team gathered around the folding table. James, Leon, Robert, and now Dr. Patricia Marsh, a cognitive archaeologist who'd been brought in to analyze the carved symbols. Patricia had spent 6 hours documenting and photographing the markings. Now she sat with her laptop open, images displayed across the screen. Her expression was troubled. "These marks are not random," she said. "There's clear pattern repetition, hierarchical structure, and what appears to be syntactic organization. If I didn't know better, I'd say this was proto-writing, the kind of symbolic system that precedes true writing systems by hundreds or thousands of years." "But," Sarah prompted, "but the sediment dating puts these marks at approximately 400 years old, maybe less, which means someone with the cognitive capacity for symbolic notation was using this site well into the historical period." The silence that followed was profound. "Let me make sure I understand," Robert said carefully. "We've found evidence of a large-bodied hominid population that lived here during the Pleistocene. We've found evidence of sophisticated tool use, symbolic behavior, and complex burial practices. And now we're finding evidence that this population, or their descendants, persisted into the modern era." "That's what the data suggests," Patricia said. Leanne pulled up her genetic analysis. "There's something else. The DNA samples. I ran them through every database we have access to, and I found matches." Everyone stared at her. "Not complete genomes," she clarified, "but alleles, specific genetic markers that match the ancient DNA from the burial. They appear in modern human populations, primarily among indigenous groups in the Pacific Northwest and interior British Columbia. The frequency is low, less than 1%, but it's there. Interbreeding, James said, not just in the Pleistocene. More recently, Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. How recently? Some of these markers show evidence of selective pressure and recombination patterns consistent with admixture events in the last 500 to 1,000 years, Leon said. These weren't ancient ghosts. These were contemporary interactions. Robert stood up abruptly, walked to the edge of the tent, and stared out into the darkness of the surrounding forest. The indigenous peoples of this region have stories, he said. The Salish, the Lummi, the Snohomish. They have names for the forest people, Tsemeques, Saskets, giants who live in the deep woods, who avoid humans, who are seen only at the edges of camps and clearings. Folklore, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. Or oral history, Robert countered. Or memory. Every culture in this region has them. The stories go back generations, maybe centuries. They're not monster stories. They're accounts of another people. Separate, distinct, deliberate in their isolation. Sarah looked at the photographs of the burial, the family group carefully laid to rest with ochre and tools and obvious reverence. Then she looked at the image of the handprint and the carved symbols. "We have to make a decision," she said. "This discovery, these remains, this evidence, it's the find of the century. It rewrites human evolutionary history in North America. It proves the existence of a hominid population that survived tens of thousands of years longer than any theory predicted. Any one of us could make our careers on this. But, Patricia said, but if there's even a possibility that this population still exists, Sarah continued, that there are survivors out there living in deliberate isolation, then publishing this finding could be the worst thing we could possibly do. The weight of it settled on all of them. Think about what would happen, Sarah said. The media attention, the hunters, the thrill-seekers, the cryptozoologists, every national forest in the Pacific Northwest overrun with people looking for proof, drones, trail cameras, organized expeditions. And if they found anything, if they found evidence of a living population, what then? Capture? Study? Relocation to some kind of preserve? We'd be exposing them, Leon said quietly. Whatever survival strategy has kept them hidden for 13,000 years, we'd be destroying it. James looked anguished. But we can't just bury this. This is scientific evidence. This is a people, Robert interrupted. If they're still out there, if they've maintained their isolation this long, then they've chosen invisibility. They've chosen to remain separate from us. And maybe, given what we've done to every other indigenous population we've encountered, maybe they've made the right choice. Sarah thought about the care taken with the burial, the family group positioned together, the tools and ochre, the years of tending required to help a broken-legged individual survive, the symbolic marks carved into clay, marking memory, marking presence. We need more information, she said finally. Before we decide anything, we need to understand what we're actually dealing with. Patricia, can you analyze those symbols more thoroughly? Leon, can you refine the dating on the genetic admixture events? Robert, I need you to compile every piece of indigenous oral history you can find about the forest people. I want to know if these stories contain specific, verifiable details that suggest actual encounters rather than folklore. And then, James asked. And then, Sarah said, we decide whether science's right to know outweighs another people's right to remain hidden. The decision to search for contemporary evidence came in the third week, and it came from an unexpected source. Dr. Victoria Goodwin arrived at the research facility on a grey November morning, carrying a weathered leather satchel and an expression of profound ambivalence. She was Snohomish, a professor of indigenous studies at Evergreen State College, and she'd been contacted by Robert after he'd read her published work on traditional ecological knowledge among Coast Salish peoples. Sarah met her in the conference room they'd converted from a construction trailer. Victoria set her sachet on the table and looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too many well-meaning academics extract knowledge from indigenous communities without giving anything back. "Dr. Whitmore said you found remains," Victoria said. "Old remains, and that you're trying to decide what to do about them." "That's right. And you want to know about the Saskats, about what my people remember." Sarah nodded. "If you're willing to share." Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she opened her satchel and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cedar bark cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a series of objects: carved wooden figures, strips of hide with painted symbols, and a small leather journal filled with handwritten notes. "My great-grandmother was a knowledge keeper," Victoria said. "She passed these to my grandmother, who passed them to my mother, who gave them to me before she died. They're not for museums, they're not for publication, they're family history, but they're also something else." She picked up one of the wooden figures, a humanoid form, large and broad-shouldered, carved with surprising detail. "The Saskats aren't monsters in our stories. They're people, different people, but people. My great-grandmother's grandmother, this would be in the 1860s, she said her mother knew them, not as stories, as neighbors." Sarah leaned forward. "Neighbors? They lived in the deep forest, in the places humans didn't go, the high valleys, the dense cedar groves, the caves in the mountain faces. But sometimes they came down. Sometimes there were interactions, trade occasionally, food left at the boundaries, and sometimes, very rarely, more than that." Victoria pulled out the leather journal, opened it to a page marked with a strip of deer hide. "My great-grandmother wrote down what she remembered, the stories that were too specific to be mythology. Listen, Mother said that when she was a girl, a Saskats woman came to the village in the hard winter. She was starving, alone. The women of the village fed her, gave her dried fish and camas root. She stayed 3 days, sleeping in the longhouse. She couldn't speak our language, but she understood gestures. When she left a gift, a beautiful basket woven from cedar root, finer than anything our people made. And she touched her forehead to my great-grandmother's forehead, and they both cried." The detail was staggering, the specificity. "There are dozens of accounts like this in the journals," Victoria continued. "Not all of them are peaceful. There were conflicts, territorial disputes, but there were also long periods of coexistence. The Saskats avoided humans mostly, but they shared the land. They had their places, we had ours, and there were rules about the boundaries." Robert had joined them now, along with Patricia and Leon. They sat listening with the intensity of people hearing evidence that overturned everything they thought they knew. "When did the account stop?" Robert asked. Victoria's expression darkened. "When the settlers came, when logging started, when the railroads were built and the forests were cut down. The Saskats retreated further into the wilderness, into the places humans couldn't easily reach. The last account in my great-grandmother's journal is from 1923. She wrote, 'Saw tracks by the salmon stream too large for a man. Left smoked fish on a flat stone, as Mother taught me. 2 days later the fish was gone, and there was a bundle of cedar fronds arranged in a spiral pattern. A message: we are still here. Remember us.'" Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes. "They wanted to be remembered. They didn't want to be forgotten," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference. They didn't want contact. They'd learned what contact with white civilization meant. But they didn't want to disappear from memory either. They wanted someone to know they'd existed, that they'd mattered, that they'd been people." Patricia pulled up the photographs of the carved symbols from the excavation site. "Could these markings be related to the spiral patterns you mentioned?" Victoria studied the images carefully. "The geometric forms, yes, these circles and chevrons, they appear in Saskats markers according to the journals. They're not writing exactly, more like signatures, identity markers, claims. Like cairns," Patricia said, "or boundary stones. Like gravestones," Victoria said quietly. "Places where memory lives." The research shifted after Victoria's visit. They were no longer simply studying ancient remains. They were attempting to understand a people who had lived alongside humans for thousands of years, who had developed strategies for survival through climate change, megafauna extinctions, human expansion, and industrial civilization. Leanne expanded her genetic analysis, working with Victoria to obtain DNA samples from Snohomish tribal members who'd volunteered to participate. The results were illuminating and troubling. The introgressed alleles are there, Leanne explained at their next team meeting. Low frequency, but present in approximately 0.7% of the samples, and they're not randomly distributed. They cluster in family lines that Victoria identifies as traditionally associated with specific geographic regions. She pulled up a map showing genetic distribution overlaid with traditional Snohomish territorial boundaries. Look at this. The alleles are most common in families whose traditional lands were in the Cascade foothills, in the areas with dense forest cover and limited historical logging, the areas where the Saskat's accounts are most numerous. So the interbreeding wasn't just Pleistocene, James said. It was ongoing. For thousands of years, Leanne confirmed, rare but consistent. The genetic evidence suggests small-scale admixture events roughly every 50 to 100 years, going back at least 5,000 years. Robert was studying the map intently. That's not random interbreeding. That's too regular. That's deliberate. A cultural practice, Patricia suggested. Victoria, who'd been consulting with the team regularly now, nodded slowly. There are stories about that too. Veiled stories. About women who went to the forest and came back pregnant. About children who were larger than normal, stronger, who felt uncomfortable in the village and disappeared into the woods when they were old enough. The stories always said it was a choice, that the Saskats would never force anyone, but that sometimes there were unions to maintain lines, to keep connections, to prevent inbreeding, Leanne said suddenly. Christ! A small population with low genetic diversity, they'd face inbreeding depression, but if they occasionally interbred with humans, they'd introduce new genetic variation. It would be a survival strategy. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together. That's why they wanted to be remembered, not just for cultural reasons, for practical ones. They needed humans to know they existed, to maintain the possibility of genetic exchange, of continued survival. But secretly, Robert said, always secretly, always at the edges, never revealing themselves fully. Because full revelation meant extinction, Victoria said. It always has. For every indigenous people who've encountered industrial civilization, contact has meant disease, displacement, genocide. The Saskats learned that early. They chose isolation over annihilation. The ethical implications were crushing. They met in Sarah's university office on a December evening, the 5 core researchers plus Victoria. Snow was falling outside, the first of the season, dusting the Seattle streets with white. We have to discuss publication, James said. He looked exhausted, torn between scientific duty and moral obligation. We've been sitting on the most significant paleoanthropological discovery in a century. The remains alone would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution in North America. But combined with the genetic evidence, the contemporary accounts, the possibility of a living population, we'd be famous, Patricia said flatly. Every one of us. Paper in Nature, cover of National Geographic, research grants for life. And we'd be murderers, Robert said. The word hung in the air like a curse. Think about what would happen, Robert continued. The moment we publish, this becomes global news. Within days, every square mile of wilderness in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia would be flooded with people looking for proof. Legitimate researchers, sure, but also hunters, sensation seekers, filmmakers, tourists. They'd use drones, satellite imagery, eDNA sampling, acoustic monitoring, thermal cameras. And the moment anyone found evidence of a living population, that population would lose the only protection they have: secrecy. They'd be classified, Leon said bitterly. Studied, likely designated as an endangered species, which sounds protective but means tracking, monitoring, maybe capture for breeding programs. They'd lose their autonomy. They'd become specimens. Or targets, Victoria added. There are people who'd see them as threats or as trophies. Legal protections only work if they can be enforced, and you can't enforce laws in millions of acres of wilderness. Sarah pulled up a document she'd been drafting, a list of potential consequences. I've been gaming this out. Best case scenario: massive conservation effort, protected corridors, restricted access to key habitats. The Saskats become a cause célèbre for environmentalists, but they also become visible, tracked, their movements monitored, their population counted and managed. They lose the ability to control their own destiny. And worst-case scenario? James asked. Extinction within a generation, Sarah said. Disease alone could do it. A population that's been genetically isolated for thousands of years would have no immunity to modern pathogens. One careless researcher with a cold could trigger an epidemic. Or there's direct persecution. There are people who'd kill them out of fear or sport, or because they're seen as competition for resources. Or simple harassment. Imagine trying to maintain a hidden population when every piece of your territory is under constant surveillance. Patricia pulled out the photographs of the burial again. The family group, arranged with care, marked with ochre. These people buried their dead with love, she said quietly. They developed sophisticated tool technologies. They created symbolic art. They maintained a culture for at least 13,000 years through climate change and human expansion. They survived by becoming invisible, and we're considering whether to destroy that survival strategy for the sake of scientific knowledge. Science is about truth, James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Science is about understanding, Robert countered, and sometimes understanding means knowing when to remain silent. The Saskats have chosen invisibility. They've maintained that choice for thousands of years. Who are we to override that choice because we think the world has a right to know? Victoria had been quiet, but now she spoke. In my culture, there's a concept: witnessing without possessing. You can know something exists. You can honor its existence without needing to own it, control it, or make it public. The Saskats are part of my people's history. They're in our stories, our memories, our DNA, but they're not ours to reveal. They're their own people, with their own right to self-determination. So what do we do? Leon asked. We have the remains. We have the genetic data. We have the accounts and the symbols and the evidence. We can't just pretend we never found it. Sarah had been thinking about this for days. We protect them, she said finally. We create a protocol for silence. We document everything meticulously, thoroughly, and we archive it. We create a sealed record that can be accessed only under specific conditions, and we make a pact. A pact? James frowned. We agree that this knowledge stays contained, Sarah said. The 6 of us, plus any researchers we absolutely need to bring in, all under the strictest NDAs. We study the remains privately. We expand our understanding without publishing. And we use that understanding to protect the living population. How? Patricia asked. We identify their territory based on the genetic distributions, the historical accounts, the ecological requirements for a large-bodied hominid population. We work with indigenous land trusts and conservation organizations to acquire or protect those areas, not as Bigfoot habitat, which would attract attention, but as critical ecological corridors for salmon, spotted owls, whatever cover story works. We create protected zones where they can continue to live undisturbed. Without telling anyone what we're actually protecting, Robert said, understanding dawning. Exactly. We become their advocates without revealing their existence. We use our scientific expertise to ensure their survival strategy, invisibility, remains viable. The decision wasn't unanimous. James ultimately refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement, arguing that science required transparency. He resigned from the project, returning to his teaching position at Johns Hopkins, with a letter of recommendation from Sarah and a severance payment that ensured his silence through legal means rather than ethical ones. The others committed. Over the next 3 months, they worked in absolute secrecy. The remains were stored in a secure facility at the University of Washington, accessible only to the core team. The genetic data was encrypted. The excavation site was backfilled, and the construction project allowed to proceed under the cover story that the bones had been from an unusually large grizzly bear, a species known to have existed in the region during the Pleistocene. Patricia and Victoria worked together to compile a comprehensive archive of Saskat's accounts from indigenous oral histories throughout the Pacific Northwest. The patterns that emerged were striking. The accounts were geographically concentrated in areas with specific characteristics: high elevation, dense canopy cover, proximity to salmon-bearing streams, and limited human development. These areas formed corridors through the Cascade and Coast mountain ranges, connecting habitat patches across hundreds of miles. Robert, using the ecological data, created detailed habitat models. If they're still out there, they need territory, he explained. A breeding population, even a small one, requires a minimum range to maintain genetic diversity and adequate resources. Based on the body size estimates from the skeletal remains and the caloric requirements for a large-bodied hominid, we're looking at a range of approximately 50 to 100 individuals spread across maybe 10,000 square miles of optimal habitat. That's a lot of territory, Leanne said. It's a lot of emptiness, Robert corrected, which is exactly what they need. And most of it is already in some form of public ownership: national forests, wilderness areas, state lands, but it's fragmented. They need connectivity. They need corridors that allow them to move between habitat patches without being detected. This became their focus, quietly lobbying for expanded wilderness protections, supporting indigenous land-back initiatives, working with conservation organizations to purchase and protect key corridor areas. They used every justification except the real one: salmon habitat restoration, old-growth forest preservation, wildlife corridor connectivity, carbon sequestration, indigenous cultural sites. And it worked. Over 3 years, they helped protect an additional 75,000 acres of critical habitat, creating connected corridors through the Cascade Mountains and into British Columbia. The confirmation came in the 4th year, and it came as a gift. Sarah had returned to the original excavation site, now covered by a luxury housing development, to collect additional soil samples for refined dating analysis. She was working at the edge of the development where it bordered national forest land, in a small grove of old-growth cedar that had been preserved as a buffer zone. She found it at the base of one of the ancient cedars, a pile of carefully arranged riverstones stacked in a deliberate cairn pattern. And beneath the stones, wrapped in a piece of tanned hide, was an object. Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped it. Inside was a carved wooden figure, similar to the ones Victoria had shown her from her family's collection. But this one was different. It was fresh, recently made, the cedar wood still fragrant. The carving showed exquisite detail. A humanoid figure with pronounced brow ridges and powerful shoulders, standing upright, one hand raised in what might have been a gesture of greeting or farewell. And attached to the figure with a thin strip of sinew was a small piece of birch bark. On it, painted in what looked like charcoal mixed with berry juice, were symbols, circles and chevrons, the same geometric patterns they'd found carved in clay at the burial site. But there was something else. Next to the traditional symbols was something new, a handprint, not pressed into clay this time, but painted carefully onto the bark. Small by Saskat's standards, perhaps a juvenile's hand, or even a child's, but undeniably there, undeniably recent. and above the handprint a single symbol that Patricia would later identify as potentially linguistic, a circle with a line through it pointing upward. When Sarah called the team together to show them what she'd found, Victoria was the one who interpreted it. "That symbol," she said, tracing it with her finger without touching the precious bark. "It appears in the old journals. My great-grandmother translated it as remember, or maybe witness, or possibly guardian." The language was never precise in translation. It was more conceptual than literal. "They know," Leanne breathed. "They know we found the burial. They know we've been protecting the habitat. And they're acknowledging it. They're saying thank you," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "They're saying, we see what you're doing. We understand. Remember us." Robert carefully photographed the carving and the bark painting, documenting every detail. Then, following Victoria's guidance, they rewrapped the objects and returned them to the spot where Sarah had found them, adding their own offering, a bundle of smoked salmon, wrapped in waxed cloth to preserve it, and a small metal box containing written letters from each of the team members. The letters said, in essence, the same thing. "We know you're here. We will keep your secret. We will protect your home. You are not forgotten." That night, in Sarah's office, the team gathered one final time to seal the archive. All the data, all the photographs, all the genetic analyses and maps and historical accounts were compiled into a single encrypted database. Hard copies were stored in a secure vault. Access would require unanimous consent from all living members of the core team, and after their deaths, the archive would pass to designated successors. Researchers who'd been carefully vetted, who understood the ethical dimensions, who'd committed to maintaining the covenant of silence. "This is it," Sarah said, entering the final encryption key. "Once this is locked, we're committed. No papers, no publications, no recognition. Everything we've learned stays sealed until—" "What? When do we ever allow this to be revealed?" Victoria answered. "When they decide, if they ever decide. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000, maybe never. But it's their choice. We're just the guardians. We're witnesses," Patricia said. "We're the ones who saw, who knew, who chose to remember without possessing." Leanne raised a glass of whiskey. They'd agreed this moment called for something ceremonial. "To the Saskets. May they endure. May they remain hidden. May they be remembered. To the people in the shadows," Robert added, "may we be worthy of their trust. To the choice to remain silent," Sarah said. "May it protect them." They drank, and Sarah locked the archive. The challenges began in the 7th year of their silent guardianship, and they began with technology. The proliferation of trail cameras throughout the Pacific Northwest had been gradual but exponential. Hunters, researchers, and wildlife enthusiasts deployed thousands of motion-activated cameras across federal and state lands, ostensibly to monitor deer, elk, and predator populations. Most captured exactly what they were intended to: wildlife going about their lives, unaware of human observation. But occasionally, the cameras caught something else. Robert was the first to notice the pattern. As part of his ongoing habitat monitoring, conducted under the cover of his legitimate research on black bear populations, he'd gained access to a wildlife camera database maintained by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He was reviewing footage from cameras in the Cascade Mountain corridor when he saw it. A blur of movement, there and gone in less than a second, captured at 3:47 a.m. on a remote trail camera in the Glacier Peak wilderness. The image was ambiguous. It could have been a trick of shadows, a person in dark clothing, even a bear standing upright. But the proportions were wrong, the gate was off, and the location was 15 miles from the nearest road, in terrain that recreational hikers rarely penetrated. He downloaded the image and ran it through their private analysis system, software that Patricia had helped develop to identify Saskat's consistent features: body proportions, locomotion patterns, size relationships to surrounding vegetation. The software flagged it as 73% probability. Robert immediately contacted the others. They met at Sarah's office 2 days later. The atmosphere was tense. They'd always known this moment might come, that the increasing technological monitoring of wilderness areas would eventually capture evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. But they'd hoped for more time. "It's just one image," Leanne said, studying the printout. "Ambiguous. Deniable." "It's been posted online," Robert said grimly. "The camera was maintained by a citizen science project. They post all their footage to a public database. This image has been viewed 47,000 times in the last 24 hours. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Where's the discourse?" "Reddit, cryptozoology forums, Facebook groups. Some people are calling it definitive proof. Others are calling it a hoax. A few are calling it just a person in dark clothing. But the location data is embedded in the image file. People know exactly where this was taken." "Fuck," Patricia said, which was unusual enough that everyone looked at her. "How long before people start going to that location?" "Too late," Robert said. "There are already posts about organizing expeditions. Someone's calling it Operation Cascade Proof. They're planning a coordinated search with drones and thermal cameras." Victoria had been silent, but now she spoke. "We need to contain this." "How?" Leanne asked. "We can't control the internet. We can't stop people from going into the wilderness." "No," Victoria agreed. "But we can muddy the waters. We can create noise. We can make this image one of 1,000 similar images, most of which are obviously explainable. We can drown the signal in static." Sarah understood immediately. "We flood the zone. We create our own trail camera images, people in ghillie suits, clever camera angles, known hoaxes. We seed them into the same databases, the same forums. We make it impossible to know what's real." "It's manipulation," Robert said. "It's lying. It's protection," Victoria countered. "It's what they need from us." They implemented the plan over the next 2 months, recruiting trusted graduate students under carefully controlled conditions. The students believed they were participating in a study of how misinformation spreads in cryptozoology communities. They didn't know the real stakes. The team created dozens of ambiguous images and videos. People in dark clothing, filmed from unusual angles, deliberately blurry footage, thermal camera captures of campers that could be misinterpreted as unknown primates. They seeded these into public databases and forums, always with plausible cover stories. The strategy worked. Within weeks, the original image was buried in an avalanche of similar content. The discourse shifted from "is this real?" to "how can we tell what's real?" Skepticism became the dominant narrative. The planned expeditions fizzled as people argued about methodology and authenticity rather than organizing actual searches. But the episode had shaken the team. They'd crossed a line, moved from passive protection to active deception, and they'd realized how fragile their guardianship really was. One clear image, one definitive piece of evidence, and the entire protective structure they'd built could collapse. The second challenge came from an unexpected direction: academic politics. Dr. James Okonkwo, the forensic osteologist who'd resigned from the project 7 years earlier, published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution. The paper didn't mention the Cascade burial directly, but it presented a theoretical framework for identifying cryptic hominid populations in the archaeological record of North America. It discussed morphological markers, genetic signatures, and burial practices that would indicate the presence of a previously unknown hominid species. The paper was academically rigorous and carefully worded. It didn't make any definitive claims. But to anyone who knew what to look for, anyone who'd seen the Cascade burial, it was a roadmap. Sarah read the paper in her office, feeling sick. James hadn't violated the NDA technically. He hadn't mentioned the specific find, hadn't shared the data, hadn't revealed the location, but he'd published enough information that a competent researcher could potentially reconstruct the key markers. And in the paper's acknowledgements, he'd thanked colleagues in the Pacific Northwest whose work inspired these theoretical explorations. It was a message, a challenge. James was saying, I haven't forgotten. I think the world deserves to know, and I'm going to keep pushing. The team met to discuss their response. The conversation was heated. He's going to publish eventually, Lian said. He's building a case, creating a theoretical framework. Once he has enough supporting structure, he'll release the actual findings. Can we stop him legally? Patricia asked. The NDA is solid, Sarah said, but enforcing it means going to court, which means publicity, which defeats the purpose. And proving he violated it when he's being this careful about what he publishes, that's difficult. We need to talk to him, Robert said. Directly. Make him understand what's at stake. He knows what's at stake, Victoria said quietly. He's a scientist. He's chosen to prioritize knowledge over protection. We're not going to change his mind with rational arguments. Then what? Lian asked. Sarah thought about the carved figure, the painted handprint, the message. Remember us, not reveal us, not study us, remember. We give him a different priority, she said. We show him evidence that changes the calculation. They arranged to meet James at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Seattle's University District, away from campus politics and institutional oversight. James arrived looking older than Sarah remembered, grayer, more lined, but with the same intense focus in his eyes. Sarah, he said, sitting down across from her, I wondered if you'd reach out. Your paper, Sarah said. It's good work, solid theoretical framework. But you're concerned. I'm terrified, Sarah said honestly. James, I understand why you feel compelled to publish. I understand the scientific imperative, but I'm asking you to reconsider. James's expression hardened. We had this argument 7 years ago. My position hasn't changed. This is the find of a lifetime, possibly the find of the century. Keeping it hidden is a betrayal of everything science stands for. Is it? Sarah pulled out a tablet, opened a folder of images. I want to show you something. These are photographs from the last 7 years, not from the original excavation, from ongoing field observations. She showed him the carved figure she'd found at the cedar grove, the painted handprint, the stone cairns they'd discovered at 3 other locations, all in protected forest land, all with similar offerings of carved wood and symbolic markings. James studied the images, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock. These are recent. Within the last 7 years, there have been others. Not frequent, maybe one every 18 months, but consistent. They know we found the burial. They know we're protecting the habitat, and they're communicating with us. Jesus Christ, James whispered. They're not extinct, James. They're endangered, they're tiny in number, but they're alive, and they've chosen to remain hidden. Every one of these offerings reinforces that choice. They're not reaching out for contact, they're thanking us for silence. She showed him more images, trail camera footage they'd collected but never shared, showing blurred movements at the edges of protected areas. Environmental DNA results from water samples in key corridors, showing genetic signatures consistent with the ancient burial remains. And finally, audio recordings, captured by acoustic monitoring equipment, ostensibly deployed for owl and bat surveys, of vocalizations that were almost human, almost language, but not quite either. We have evidence of approximately 50 to 80 individuals, Sarah said, distributed across maybe 15,000 square miles of protected and semi-protected habitat. The population is stable but fragile. A single catastrophic event, disease, fire, concentrated human intrusion, could eliminate them entirely. James sat back, his face pale. You've been studying them for 7 years, without telling me. We've been protecting them, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. We're not tracking individuals. We're not using invasive monitoring. We're simply maintaining awareness of the population while ensuring their habitat remains secure and their presence remains unknown. And you want me to abandon publication? I want you to understand that publication means extinction, Sarah said. Not eventually, not theoretically. Within a single generation, the moment the world knows they exist, they lose the only defense they have. You talk about scientific responsibility. What about ethical responsibility? What about the responsibility to do no harm? James looked at the images again, particularly the painted handprint. That's a child, he said quietly. Yes, they're reproducing, successfully. At a replacement rate, barely. Lian's genetic modeling suggests they're right at the edge of minimum viable population. One generation of reproductive failure, and they're gone. James was silent for a long time. Sarah didn't push. She simply let the evidence speak, the carved figures, the cairns, the handprints, the vocalizations. A people still here, still choosing invisibility, still trusting that the humans who knew their secret would keep it. Finally, James spoke. If I don't publish, someone else will eventually. You can't protect them forever. Maybe not, Sarah agreed, but we can protect them today and tomorrow and for as long as we can. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all guardianship ever is, buying time, creating space, hoping that the future will be kinder than the present. That's not science, James said. That's faith. Maybe good science requires both, Sarah said. James didn't agree to abandon his research, but he did agree to a compromise. He would continue his theoretical work, but he would delay publication of any specific findings until the Saskat's population had recovered to a more stable level, a threshold the team set at 200 individuals across the monitoring range, with evidence of successful reproduction in at least 3 separate subpopulations. That could take decades, James pointed out. Good, Sarah said. He rejoined the team under those conditions. His expertise in osteology and forensic analysis proved invaluable as they refined their understanding of Saskat's morphology and pathology. And his presence, Sarah realized, was itself a form of protection. Better to have him inside the guardianship than outside it, potentially competing or contradicting their efforts. The crisis came in the 12th year, and it came from climate. The fire season of 2036 was catastrophic. Prolonged drought, combined with unprecedented heat waves, turned the Pacific Northwest's forests into tinder. By August, more than 4 million acres across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia were burning. The team watched in horror as fires swept through key Saskat's habitat corridors. The Glacier Peak Wilderness, where Robert had first identified concentrated activity, burned for 6 weeks straight. The smoke was so thick that satellite imagery became useless. Ground observations were impossible due to evacuation orders. "We're losing them," Lian said at an emergency meeting in September. Her eyes were red, whether from smoke or tears, Sarah couldn't tell. "We're losing the habitat, and we can't even know if they're getting out." Robert had been modeling fire behavior and potential refuge areas. "There are pockets," he said, pointing to his maps. "High-elevation meadows above the burn zone, river corridors that the fire is jumping over. But the connectivity is being destroyed. Even if individuals survive, the population is being fragmented." "Can we help?" Patricia asked. "Can we, I don't know, create fire breaks, redirect resources?" "To where?" Robert asked. "We can't identify their locations precisely. We don't know where they are in real time. All we can do is protect the refugia we think they might use and hope they're smart enough to find them." Victoria had been on the phone with tribal authorities, coordinating firefighting efforts that prioritized culturally significant areas. "I've got 3 crews focused on protecting the cedar groves in the upper Stillaguamish watershed," she reported, "and 2 more in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. We're calling it cultural resource protection, which it is, but we're selecting areas based on the Saskat's habitat models." "It's not enough," James said. "Even if they survive the fires, the post-fire landscape will be devastated. No food sources, no cover. They'll be forced to move, probably into areas with more human presence." The calculations were grim. Robert's models suggested that even with successful evacuation to refuge areas, the population would likely decline by 30 to 50% due to fire-related mortality, starvation, and population fragmentation. "We might be watching them go extinct," Sarah said, "in real time. And we can't do anything about it." The helplessness was crushing, but the Saskats proved more resilient than the models predicted. The fires burned themselves out in October when the rains finally came. The team immediately mobilized, conducting careful surveys of the burned areas to assess habitat damage and look for signs of survival. What they found was both heartbreaking and hopeful. In the high-elevation meadow in the North Cascades, an area that had escaped the fires by virtue of sparse vegetation and rocky terrain, they discovered evidence of concentrated Saskats' presence. Stone cairns marked the area. Bark paintings on surviving alpine firs showed the familiar geometric symbols, and most remarkably, they found scat samples, fresh within the last few weeks, that tested positive for Saskats' DNA. "They're here," Leanne said, examining the genetic results. "Not just one individual, multiple, different haplotypes. This is a refuge group." Over the next 6 months, as spring returned and vegetation began to recover, they identified 4 separate refuge areas where Saskats' populations had concentrated during the fires. The groups ranged in size from 8 to 20 individuals, based on genetic diversity in the environmental DNA samples. Total population estimate is 45 to 60 individuals, Robert reported, down from our pre-fire estimate of 70 to 85, but viable and showing evidence of movement between refugee groups. "They're adapting," Patricia said, "reforming social groups, creating new population structure." The evidence of adaptation went beyond simple survival. In 2 of the refugee areas, the team found something unprecedented: carved wooden markers that appeared to be directional indicators, pointing from burned areas toward the refuges. The markers were positioned along probable evacuation routes, placed where they'd be visible to anyone traveling through the post-fire landscape. "They're leaving signs for each other," Victoria said, studying the photographs. "Creating a map system, helping separated individuals find the refuge groups." "That's extraordinary cognitive sophistication," James said. "That's evidence of planning, spatial reasoning, symbolic communication, social cooperation at a level we've never documented." That's evidence of a people fighting to survive," Sarah said quietly. The fire season catalyzed a shift in the team's approach. They'd been passive guardians, working to maintain invisibility and protect existing habitat. But the fires had demonstrated that passive protection wasn't enough. Climate change was accelerating, fire seasons were intensifying, and the Saskats were running out of safe space. They needed to be more active, more interventionist. Victoria took the lead on this, working with tribal authorities and conservation organizations to implement an ambitious habitat restoration program. Officially, the program was focused on post-fire recovery for wildlife, replanting native vegetation, creating water catchments, building wildlife corridors. Unofficially, every element was designed to support Saskats' population recovery. They planted berry-producing shrubs in strategic locations. They enhanced salmon streams to increase food availability. They created quiet zones in recovering forests, areas where human recreation was discouraged through clever infrastructure choices rather than explicit restrictions. And they expanded the protected corridor network, working with land trusts to acquire or place conservation easements on an additional 120,000 acres of private timberland that connected the refuge areas. "We're building them a future," Robert said, looking at the maps. "Not just protecting what exists, but actively creating the conditions for recovery." It was expensive. It was time-consuming, and it required an elaborate web of lies and half-truths to explain their funding priorities and research focus. But it was working. In the 15th year of their guardianship, Sarah returned to the cedar grove where she'd first found the carved figure. It had become a ritual, a quarterly pilgrimage to check the site, leave offerings, and look for new communications. She was expecting another carved figure, perhaps, or a cairn. What she found instead took her breath away. At the base of the ancient cedar, arranged in a careful semicircle, were 7 carved wooden figures. Not crude representations, but detailed sculptures, each distinct. An adult male, an adult female, 3 juveniles of varying sizes, and 2 infants. A family group, multiple families possibly. And in the center of the semicircle, protected under a carefully woven shelter made from cedar boughs, was a painted hide. The painting was complex, rendered in multiple colors: charcoal black, red ochre, berry juice blues and purples, and something that looked like yellow clay. It showed a landscape, stylized but recognizable: mountains, forests, rivers, and throughout the landscape small figures, some clearly human, some clearly Saskets, positioned not in conflict but in parallel, sharing the land, separate but coexisting. Around the border of the painted hide were symbols, the familiar geometric patterns of circles and chevrons, but also something new, something that looked almost like writing, or proto-writing, a sequence of marks that suggested narrative, sequence, meaning. Patricia spent 3 months analyzing the painting after Sarah carefully photographed and documented it. They never took the objects themselves, always left them in place, adding their own offerings alongside. Her conclusion was tentative, but extraordinary. "This is a history," she said at a team meeting, "or possibly a cosmology. The symbols around the border, they show temporal sequence, past, present, future. And the figures in the landscape, they're not just decorative. They're telling a story about coexistence, about sharing space while maintaining boundaries, about memory, about being remembered without being possessed." "It's a treaty," Victoria said suddenly. "That's what this is. It's a formal acknowledgement of the agreement between us. They're documenting what we've done, what they've done, and what the understanding is going forward. They're creating a record," Sarah agreed. "Something that can be passed down, something that says, this happened. These humans knew we existed. They chose to protect rather than reveal. Remember this, honor this." The weight of responsibility was almost unbearable. They created their own response, a metal capsule, carefully sealed against the elements, containing written statements from each team member. The statements explained what they'd done and why. They included detailed scientific documentation, enough that future researchers, if they ever accessed the sealed archive, would understand the full scope of the Saskets population, their biology, their culture, their history. But the capsule also contained something else: a covenant, a formal statement, signed by all team members, pledging that the knowledge they'd gained would remain sealed until either the Saskets themselves chose to reveal their existence, or until their population had recovered to a level where contact wouldn't pose an existential threat, defined as a minimum of 500 individuals across genetically diverse subpopulations. "We're binding our successors," James pointed out. "We're making decisions that will affect researchers decades or centuries from now. Dessous. We're honoring the choice of a people to remain hidden," Victoria countered. "We're respecting their autonomy over our curiosity." They buried the capsule at the base of the cedar, adding their own carved figure to the semicircle, a human figure, positioned slightly apart from the Saskets family group, hands open in a gesture of offering rather than taking. The years that followed were marked by small victories and constant vigilance. The Saskets population slowly recovered. By year 20, Robert's models estimated 75 to 90 individuals. By year 25, the estimate reached 120. The genetic diversity improved as separated populations reconnected through the restored habitat corridors. The team expanded, carefully recruiting younger researchers to eventually take over the guardianship. Each new member went through intensive vetting, not just checking their credentials, but assessing their ethics, their ability to keep secrets, their commitment to protection, over recognition. Dr. Marina Solis joined in year 17, bringing expertise in conservation genetics. Dr. Kwame Osei came aboard in year 21, a specialist in non-invasive population monitoring. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, an expert in acoustic ethology, joined in year 23 after developing algorithms to analyze the vocalizations captured on their audio equipment. Each new researcher went through the same introduction. Shown the remains, shown the genetic evidence, shown the contemporary artifacts, and finally taken to the cedar grove to see the painted hide and carved figures. Each had the same reaction: awe, followed by the crushing weight of responsibility, followed by commitment. "This is bigger than any career," Marina said after her first visit to the grove. "This is bigger than any paper, any recognition, anything. This is about giving another people the space to survive." Sarah retired from the University of Washington in year 28 of the guardianship. She was 67, tired, and increasingly aware that the project would outlive her. At her retirement gathering, a small private event attended only by the core team, she spoke about what they'd accomplished. "We've protected a people who chose invisibility over extinction," she said. "We've honored that choice. We've bought them time, maybe decades, maybe centuries. We've created the conditions for their survival without destroying the survival strategy that's kept them alive for 13,000 years. That's not a failure of science. That's science serving humanity, all of humanity, including the branches that aren't Homo sapiens." "But the work isn't done," Victoria added. She was 72 now, still sharp, still committed. "Every generation will face new challenges, new technologies, new threats, new reasons to maintain the silence. The covenant has to be renewed, reinforced, passed on. That's why we've created the succession protocols," Robert said. He was the youngest of the original team, now 58, and likely to outlive the others. Clear guidelines for recruiting new guardians, explicit ethical frameworks, and multiple redundancies. If any one person falters, there are others to maintain the protection. Liane raised a glass. "To the watchers in the shadow, to the guardians of the invisible. To every future researcher who'll take up this burden. To the Saskets," Patricia said. "May they endure unseen. May they be remembered in silence. May they know they're not alone." They drank, and Sarah felt the weight lift slightly. Not gone. It would never be gone. But shared, distributed across time and people. A collective commitment to silence. The last documented contact came in year 31. A junior researcher on routine habitat monitoring, Dr. Chen Wei, who'd been with the project for 6 years, found a new offering at the Cedar Grove. This time it was different, a woven basket exquisitely crafted from cedar root and bear grass, so fine that it could hold water. The pattern woven into it showed the familiar geometric symbols, but also something new, representations of specific locations. Mountains that could be identified, rivers that could be mapped, valleys that marked the core Saskets territory. And inside the basket were seeds. Dozens of varieties: camas bulbs, wild onion, huckleberry, salmonberry, Sitka valerian. Seeds for replanting, for restoration, for futures. "It's a gift," Victoria said when she saw it, "but it's also an instruction. They're telling us what they need. What plants are important to them, what we should prioritize in restoration efforts." The team adjusted their habitat management accordingly, focusing on the species represented in the seed basket. Over the next 5 years, they systematically replanted 50,000 acres of recovering habitat with Saskets' preferred food sources. The population continued to grow. By year 35, the estimate reached 180 individuals, still far from the 500 individual threshold they'd set for considering contact, but trending in the right direction. Sarah died in year 37 of the guardianship, peacefully, in her sleep. She was 76. Her last words to Victoria, spoken in the hospital 3 days before her death, were, "Don't let them be forgotten, but don't let them be found," Victoria promised. At Sarah's funeral, again private, attended only by the team and close family, Robert delivered the eulogy. He spoke about her career, her discoveries, her contributions to paleoanthropology, but he ended with something different. Sarah's greatest achievement won't appear in any journal, he said. It won't be taught in any classroom, it won't earn any awards, but it will endure. She helped protect a people's right to self-determination. She chose guardianship over glory. She proved that science can be guided by ethics as much as by curiosity. And because of her, a people who've survived for 13,000 years will have a chance to survive for 13,000 more. They buried her with a small carved figure, Sasquatch's work, gifted by Victoria from her family's collection. A symbol of the covenant, carried into whatever came next. The archive remains sealed, the habitat corridors remain protected, the population continues to recover, slowly, carefully, invisibly, and the team, now in its third generation of researchers, maintains the watch. They monitor without intruding, they protect without revealing, they remember without possessing. In the cedar grove, the offerings accumulate year by year, carved figures, painted hides, woven baskets, stone cairns. Each one a reminder, we are here, we see you, we trust you, remember us. And in the secure vault at the University of Washington, the encrypted archive waits. Inside it, sealed and protected, is the complete record of the Cascade burial, the genetic evidence, the habitat surveys, the artifacts, the photographs, the audio recordings. Everything needed to prove that Homo sapiens is not, and has never been, alone. But the archive remains locked. The knowledge remains contained. The covenant remains intact, because some truths are protected by silence, because some people survive through invisibility, because some scientists understand that the highest calling isn't to reveal, but to guard. The Sasquatchs endure, hidden in the last wild places, choosing every day to remain separate. And the Guardians honor that choice, choosing every day to remain silent. It is the hardest work, the most invisible work, the most important work, and it continues. On a cold November morning, 52 years after the discovery of the Cascade burial, Dr. Kwame Osei, now 74, the oldest surviving member of the original research team, made his quarterly pilgrimage to the cedar grove. He found the basket first, woven from cedar root, placed carefully at the base of the ancient tree. Inside were familiar offerings, dried berries, smoked fish, carved wooden tokens. But there was something new, a photograph. Not a painting or a carving, but an actual photograph, printed on weathered paper. The image showed a group gathered in a forest clearing. Large figures, smaller figures, clearly non-human but undeniably people. A family, or perhaps a clan. They were looking directly at the camera, or more accurately, at whatever hidden trail camera had captured this impossible image. And in the foreground, one individual held up a piece of bark. Painted on it was a single symbol, a circle with a line through it pointing upward. Remember, Kwame stood in the grove for a long time, the photograph trembling in his hands. They'd been photographed, by their own cameras likely. The Sasquatchs had taken the image, printed it somehow, and left it as a message. We know you're watching. We accept it. We trust you. Continue. He carefully documented the photograph, added his own offering, a bundle of tobacco wrapped in cloth, and left the original where he'd found it. When he returned to his car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. The weight of 52 years of silence pressed down on him. The weight of knowledge that could never be shared. The weight of guardianship that would pass to others when he was gone. But also the weight of trust, the weight of covenant. The weight of knowing that somewhere in these mountains a people endured because others had chosen to let them. He started the car and drove away, leaving the grove to its silence. Behind him, in the forest, something moved through the shadows. Large, deliberate, watching. A hand touched the cedar trunk where Kwame had stood, feeling the warmth he'd left behind. Then it was gone, fading into the green darkness, leaving only the faintest impression of passage. Remembered, protected, hidden, free. If this story moved you and left you wondering about the mysteries still hidden in our world, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. What secrets do you think nature still keeps from us? What would you do if you discovered an impossible truth? Join our community of story seekers. Let's explore the unknown together. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation into the extraordinary.